Well, welcome everyone, fellows, guests. This is the second presentation of the 2022-2023 season of the Society in the programme. So I'd like to introduce Nora Baker. Welcome. Thank you for coming and doing a presentation to us. So Nora is an assistant lecturer at the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages, University of Oxford. If she doesn't mind me saying a little bit about her. She has a Bachelor of Arts in French and Italian at the National University of Ireland, Galway, her hometown. Is that right, Nora? She has then done a master's degree in Russian and Eastern European Studies at University College, Oxford. Her Doctor of Philosophy research at Jesus College explores memoir writing by French Protestant refugees in the wake of the Revocation of Nantes 1685. As an Irish speaker, she says she has long been interested in the nature and expression of minority identity. Nora has been involved in outreach events relating to her research findings at the Hampshire Records Office in Winchester, which I know quite well. In December 2022, I believe, she was due to spend 2 weeks at the Marsh's Library in Dublin as a Magic Research Fellow. She has several forthcoming publications, and this evening Nora is presenting a paper, The Uri Family and Their Integration into English Society 1707 to 1771. And I'd like to hand over to Nora to give her presentation.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you so much to the Society for having me today. So hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties or anything. Already my green screen isn't working, so it looks like I've got a balloon or something behind me, but I'm going to try and share my screen now to see if my presentation will load. So hopefully that will work. So, oops. Let's see if I can do the slideshow. Here we go. So, Katrina, can you see that? Hopefully everyone can see that.
I hope everyone else can, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Okay, so welcome. Oops, I'm after going a few slides ahead. Okay, so welcome everyone to my talk about the Uri family. Starting off with Louis Uri and his arrival in England in the early 18th century. So I will be talking today, sorry, slides. So we'll be talking today about the Uri family throughout the 18th century primarily. So I do know that there was many descendants onward in the 19th century. We've got the Trevi Uri, and the documents that I'm going to be talking about and sharing pictures of on my screen tonight are from the Lempriere family archives in the Hampshire Record Office. But I won't be going into the detail of the families after the end of the 18th century. I'll be mostly discussing letters that were exchanged among the family members, and also a memoir written by Louis Uri about his departure from France. So these were all exchanged over the course of the 18th century. So hopefully that's okay, but I am very excited that we have members of the Uri family with us today, well, descendants with us today for this talk, and possibly they're already aware, but this day last week, which was actually when we had the run through for this talk, the 4th of January, was exactly 252 years since Louis Uri died. So he had a very long life, actually, born in 1682. Okay. So just to introduce you to the archives that I've been using. So that the archives of the Lempriere family of Pelham Palace in Newton Valence at the Hampshire Record Office. So what I kind of want to do today is talk about the emotions that we can see in the letters exchanged between the family members. So because a lot of Louis Urie's descendants, and also he himself joined the English army, but his sons, especially Paul Henry Urie, is quite well known for having been involved with the military operations during the 7 Years' War, and his son Louis Urie as well. I'm going to talk about some letters he sent his father while in the Americas as well. So we mentioned Charlestown earlier, which is actually where he wrote one of his letters from. Those are quite well known that the sons were involved in these kind of campaigns, but I'm not going to talk so much about these kind of military operations so much as more about the personal accounts and what we can see from their personal writing to their family members. So I'll be showing some photos on screen of letters that have been sent between family members. I really hope you can read the writing. I can translate from the French as well, for anyone who doesn't know French, and hopefully we can read a little bit about it, and I find it interesting to see the insights on what they felt at different points in time. So hold on, see if I can change slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the family in the Channel Islands and in England. So here's a little introduction to the principal figures I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm primarily going to focus on just these people, because otherwise we get tangled up in a web. It's quite a big family. So I'm going to talk primarily about, first of all, about Louis Urie. So thank you to Sandra Robinson, who's here today, because she sent me a photo of his baptismal certificate from Blois in 1682, which I hadn't previously seen, as I hadn't been to France actually to look in archives there. I'd just been based in England. So it's very exciting. So I'll start off by talking about him. Then I'll talk about his son, who is also called Louis Urie, but sometimes his name is written in a kind of anglicized form as Louis, and his middle name is Simon. So to distinguish him from his father, because it can get confusing when a lot of people in families have the same names. There's a lot of Annes and Elizabeths in this family as well, as I will talk about in a minute. So I'm going to try and call him Louis Simon Urie, just so that we can be clear that he's different person to his father, to avoid any confusion about that. So he's baptized in Wandsworth, 24th of February, 1717. Then his younger brother, Paul Henry Urie, who I mentioned a few minutes ago as well, is quite well known for being involved in naval operations, and he married Charity Treby in Devon in 1749. Oh, I think there's some microphone accidentally. Okay, so then I'm going to briefly mention Magdalene Urie. So she was unmarried, so we can't really talk about her relationship with her descendants, but we do have some letters from her father addressed to her that I'm going to be talking about this evening, which I think are kind of interesting, because he seems a little bit upset with her. So, you know, I can't completely conjecture as to why that was, but it just might be interesting to think about as well. Then we've got Elizabeth Busville, who was born Elizabeth Urie. So she married Samuel Busville in 1674, and they lived in Bethnal Green, which is also where Louis Urie died. And we'll see that he actually died while he was staying with them, as we'll talk about later on. And then I'm also going to talk about her husband, who obviously wasn't actually a biological member of the Urie family, but he was a prominent member of the Huguenot diaspora, as he was a minister of the French Church in Spitalfields, and he was very close to the Urie family as well. And we see from his correspondence with his wife's siblings as well that they were all very close together. So I thought it was worth talking about him in relation to the family as well, because his letters also appear in the same archive, so I was looking at them as well. And if anybody's interested, we might have some time at the end as well to discuss the fact that in the history of the Merchant Tailors School from 1814, I found someone has written a very dramatic account of him leaving France when he was a child. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. They just said that someone told them the story about him leaving France as a child. So it's not exactly relevant to the Uri family, but it is a kind of interesting French departure story post-revocation. So might be interested in discussing that at the end if we've got time. Hopefully my slides will, I don't know why it's not changing. Oh, here we go. Okay, so yes, I was just going to talk about the fact that there are many people with the same name, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Uri and Uri. So here I've got a picture of Elizabeth Uri seated at a table with her sewing bag, which apparently was painted in 1780. But I saw that on the where I found this was actually on a British auctioneer's website, but it was also on the Huguenot Society of Australia page I found. So it seemed to be legitimate, but what I found curious was that her date of birth there was given as 1745, but the baptismal record for Elizabeth Uri as the daughter of Louis Uri and Anne-Louise Beauvais is actually from 1725. And because Beauvais died in 1732, it seems unlikely that that Elizabeth Uri was actually born in 1745. So possibly there was some confusion because there was also Elizabeth Uri born in, or baptized at least in Saint Helier in August 1751, but that's actually a daughter of her brother, Louis Simon. I mentioned earlier her older brother. So perhaps the confusion arises from that. Also, if this painting, I thought at least, if this painting was from 1780, it seems more likely that she looks a little bit older there than I think she would have been 35, right, if she was born in 1745. So she looks a little bit older than that. So I think perhaps the birth year of 1725 seems a little bit more accurate. Okay, so who was Louis Uri? Let's get to the story of how he left France. And I'm going to do that by looking at this manuscript that I found in the archives in Hampshire Record Office, where there's a journal written of his departure from France. So I think there's some microphone interference there. Okay, I think hopefully you can hear me, but please let me know if you can't hear me at any point. And I might be able to see if I can zoom in on certain words as well, if my screen sharing expertise allows. But I'm not sure if you can read the handwriting here, but it says Journal de Monsieur Lieutenant Louis Uri, Père de Madame Besville. Now, I don't think this is the original handwriting. It seems someone has copied this out because, and I might be able to show some other pictures of this later, I haven't got them on the slides here, but in the back of the same kind of copybook that this is written into, there's also an account of a court case from the 19th century. So it seems possible that a descendant might have copied this out. And indeed, at the end of this account of Louis Uri, someone has written that the manuscript has become so illegible that it can't be continued. And then it talks about the fact that that he died in Bethnal Green in 1771. So that is written in a different hand, though. So it's a little bit unclear. Could have been perhaps that Louis Uri himself wrote some of it, and the pages were later put into a different binding. But as I will discuss a little bit later as well about some notes left by descendants on some of these documents, there are a little bit of things that are sometimes ambiguous, let's say. Anyway, let's have a look at his journal. The slide changes. Not sure why it's not changing. Here we go. Okay, so yes, this is what I was talking about at the back of the manuscript. You see the end of one hand, and it seems like I'm not sure if you can see my arrow on the screen, but between these two different hands, we see someone has written the letters P-O. So it looks like they might be starting a sentence with maybe the French word pour, for. But then someone else has written here, the manuscript is so ripped up that we can't continue the journal. But that seems to be in the same hand as the person who's written the title of the journal that we saw on the last slide. So it's a little bit unclear about who did that. They haven't signed their name, but it's likely a descendant, because they've also, in the same hand, is written in the corners of some of the letters that we're going to look at as well. So what does this journal say? Well, it's an account of Ulrich's kind of life as a young man. He leaves his house because he doesn't want to be taken away from his parents, which was, as I'm sure you all know, a not uncommon fate for young people in France in the 1680s if they were from Protestant families. So he starts off in a way that's actually not atypical for these kind of accounts, which, as you may know as well, especially if you're familiar with the work of people such as Caroline Chapelle-Lugy and Ruth Whelan, a lot of the time people kind of wrote memoirs after the revocation when they came to live in different countries, and oftentimes when they went to consistories in different countries, they made this act de faire reconnaissance and kind of give an account of how they left France and perhaps people they met along the way. So here you might notice that he mentions, if you can read the text there, or I'll just read it out for you. He mentions that Louis XIV, Louis XIV has decided to make laws against his subjects who had been the most loyal to them. So, ces sujets qui lui étaient les plus fidèles, je veux dire les protestants. So he's kind of defending them. And this is also kind of a not uncommon kind of thing to mention in a lot of these accounts at the time. And say, well, he had no business, persecuting the Protestants. We were actually very loyal to him. And his mention of the word persecution as well is very common in these kind of stories. And I work on a lot of those for my thesis as well. For example, other ones such as Huguenot, such as Blanche Gamon, and I can discuss those further as well if you're interested as well. But so yeah, we can see a not atypical account from the beginning of Louis Ulrich. So he talks about his fear of being taken away from his mother and father, being brought up in what he calls his Catholic religion, superstition and error. Now he doesn't actually leave until he's the age of 17. And when he does leave his house, he takes with him 3 gold doubloons and a stick, and he is kind of prepared. And he doesn't actually immediately leave France. So he's from Blois, as I think I might have mentioned when we were looking at the characters, the different people I'll be talking about today. So he's from Blois originally. He goes to live with his aunt at first, but she still lives in France, so he doesn't actually immediately leave the country. And it's not until quite a few years later that he does that. Let's see, I did have some other pictures. Oh, sorry. Of that, but I'm not sure if I can share them on this screen or not. But basically, he talks about the fact that he goes to live with his aunt and kind of helps her with her business for a few years. Then eventually he decides to go down and he goes into Spain, actually. And I'm not sure how accurate his account is, but he has a lot of funny commentaries on the places that he visits. And it's almost like it's between an account of persecution, but also slightly a travel writing, a piece of travel writing, because he talks about a lot of towns that he visits while he works his way through France to go to Spain, which seems an unusual choice of country as well, because we know it's a Catholic country. But while working his way through France, he says, oh yes, I visited, well, I'll let historians talk about Blois. I'm not going to dwell on Blois, where he's from, but he talks a little bit about Amboise, but he doesn't dwell on it, which is maybe unusual because, yeah, as I'm sure those of you very familiar with Huguenot history will know, you know, it's kind of infamous as the site of the conspiracy of Amboise plot in the 16th century. And he talks about Poe, saying that that is very nice. So he really goes into detail on some towns, then says that other ones don't have anything noteworthy about them at all. So it's interesting that he kind of gives this detail while he's talking about his journey. So he actually joins the English army, but he says that he doesn't really know English when he bumps into them. And he ends up fighting with them in the War of Spanish Succession, actually. And eventually, so I won't tell the whole story. I do have a blog post about it in a little bit more detail if you want to read it. But I do want to talk about other members of his family as well. But basically, he joins the English, and he eventually ends up moving to England himself. And it's sort of at that point that this account, at least the one that we have of it in the Hampshire Record Office, ends. So the account actually, it's almost less about what you might expect. It's almost less about his experience of living in France under persecution, almost more about his experience traveling around to different towns, because then he goes to Italy as well, and he goes all the way up through Germany and just makes mention of whether people are nice to him or not. But he doesn't actually talk in much detail about religion, which is kind of curious. I mean, obviously he does at the beginning, of course, but he doesn't really mention much about saying psalms, or he doesn't give that many scriptural references, which might be more expected to be found in post-revocation accounts. So that was worth noting. But he does, when he does settle in England, and then he, after living on the English mainland, we saw that one of his sons was born in Wandsworth as well. He goes and lives in Jersey, where most of his children were born. And when he is settled in the Channel Islands, we see in the letters that he writes to his children, he does have far more scriptural references in those than he does perhaps in this particular manuscript, or at least what remains of it, as far as we can tell. So I wanted to focus a little bit now on his family ties and sometimes reprimands that he gives to his children. Now, of course, it can, because of the limited nature of what has come down to us over, the past couple hundred years, sometimes we can only speculate as to what the nature of the arguments between them truly were. But there are some things that are curious. So I've got some conjectures. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts perhaps on the backgrounds of some of these arguments as well. So we'll start off by looking at some letters written to the daughter Magdalene. So that's the girl who died unmarried. So here on the right, if you can see, sorry, this is the left. If you can see on the left, I've got a letter from Guernsey, dated the 31st of July, 1750. And he says to Magdalene that he's very aware that the fact that he's gone is very painful for her. So I'm very interested in the fact that he focuses a lot on the pain that this separation is causing her, but he also instructs her to take it in her stride because it was God's intention. And he does reprimand her a bit for being a little bit too attached to the flesh and to the things of this world. And he really thinks that she should accept that these things are kind of directed by God. And if it was God's will that he should be away for a while, she should learn to accept it, as it were. And I don't have the full letter there, but he does tell her that that would be the best course of action, to just kind of accept the fact that he's not with her at the moment. But he also mentions that he is lucky himself in that he is very well at the moment. And he takes pride in what his family does, or perhaps not pride is the right word, but joy in what his family does. So it's not an entirely shall we say cranky letter, but he does kind of instruct her to try and grin and bear the fact that he's separated from her at the moment. So then we see here I've got the next letter in the archive collection, which is also from Louis Houry, but it's addressed to his family, or to both of his daughters actually. But what he asks them to do is to kind of, again, pay less attention to things of the body, more to things of the soul, and to follow God's course. But he also remonstrates with them a little bit more, and claims that they kind of currently aren't doing that, and even calls out their hearts. There's actually I'm not sure if it's actually in this particular image that I've zoomed in on, but within this letter, he also accuses their hearts of being full of, if not hostility, then at least indifference, which, is maybe not the most pleasant thing to say, but he does say that, his family is a source of joy for him. The only thing is that he also talks about a slight kind of conversion, or perhaps conversion isn't the right word, but sort of like a eureka moment that he has. He describes this in this letter to his children, where he talks about how he was feeling a little bit glum himself, but then God kind of comes to him and he has this revelation that everything will kind of be okay. And it almost, reading those words, it almost kind of reminded me of some kind of commonplace associated with St. Augustine's, confession scene. He's talking a lot about, the kind of transformation of his spirit and of his heart, and dedicating them to God's service. So, what I was saying about the journal at the beginning, that's not dated, but it would be interesting to know whether he kind of wrote that before or after, or at least was composing it in a different frame of mind to what he was thinking about when he was writing these letters to his daughters. And he seems very, very serious, and really thinking over matters of religion in great detail in these letters. Oops, sorry. So, and also, as I mentioned in the slide here, you might see us say note the difference in hand. Now, I think you might notice that this letter on the left, the writing seems very similar to what we saw in the manuscript of the journal. Let's see, which I can go back to. Well, it's not identical perhaps, but we can certainly see that it's starkly different to on the right. And in fact, as I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later on, this letter on the right, at the very end of it, someone has written l'original signé Louis Houry. So it must be that someone has, it would seem that someone has written this out again. Why they would do that, I'm not sure, but it was likely one of their descendants. And this hand does seem quite similar to that seen in some of the other letters. So perhaps it's someone who, oops, sorry, someone who's involved with the archiving of their family documents. So looking at Louis's relation with Louis Simon, or Louis Houry, so even his English name. So there's a letter, so I mentioned Charlestown actually, or Charleston as we normally call it now in South Carolina, but he calls it Charlestown in this letter. he writes this letter to his father where he gives very, very detailed accounts of the people that he meets while serving in the army there, and having to transport goods, and specific prices he paid, which of course we know was of great concern to a lot of people, of course, at the time. Particular prices paid for particular goods. But what I thought was kind of touching about this was, I thought that was interesting that he writes this as well, is he goes into so much detail, minute detail about going back and forth, and having to, the details of him camping while in South Carolina and while visiting places in America. But then he mentions, so I have this quote here, je sais le plaisir que vous prenez à entendre les moindres événements qui arrivent aux enfants. Which I can translate into English. So he says, I know that the pleasure that you take in hearing the very least of events that happen to your children, especially those that concern service and their character. And that's what led me to enter into these little details, these little particularities that for others must seem insipid, but because it's you that to you I'm writing, my dear father, and for you that I'm writing, I talk frankly and naturally. So I thought it was kind of nice that he mentions that because he's writing to his father rather than to someone else. So if he was writing maybe in a militaristic domain, his tone would surely have been quite different. It's almost like he finds time to kind of jot down some thoughts and some reflections on what he finds himself doing while in America, and then he sends it off to his father because he kind of feels like he's one of the few people who might kind of get it. So as I've written here as well, he actually began the letter on the 3rd of July, but then he writes a lot later. He didn't actually finish it until the 21st of December. He says he was so busy. But again, we see at the beginning of the letter here, I've got a picture as well of where he talks about how he would like to, how he would take great pleasure in transporting his father's imagination in these wild countries where I've made war, in a very nice way, even though I'm extremely tired constantly. And I thought it was kind of, it really shows kind of the power of letters and writing as well, that he talks about transporting his father's imagination as well, and how his words can do that. And kind of helping him to imagine the circumstances that he's in, even when they're separated by such a huge difference, such a vast ocean. So more curious letter from Louis Simon and his father is from 1749. Now, this letter is dated the 4th of February, 1749, and the records from Jersey claim that his daughter was baptized on 21st of February. Sorry, that should say 21st February, not 21st. So you might think, oh, perhaps he's talking about something to do with his daughter's birth, but it doesn't seem so. So I was really, really curious about this letter, because he starts off saying that he was extremely happy to have received a letter from his father on the 6th of January. And he's just so grateful for the latest favor that his father has given him, which is better than any of the others. And there's nothing else that he could possibly ask him except to continue his friendship, and to continually have letters from his father with good advice that he's always given him, even if he hasn't always taken that advice. So he's really kind of trying to kind of humble himself almost, talking to his father in this way, saying, oh, when I was younger, maybe perhaps I didn't always take your advice, but, now I see you were always looking out for me. So I was thinking, what could have happened between them that he needs to talk about this. And so he talks about how his father was coming from a good place. And then he says that until he received the letter from his father on the 6th of January, he was in a bit of uncertainty. So he says, l'incertitude triste où j'étais en attendant votre dernière, when I was waiting for your last letter, because I looked at it and it was written in such a dark ink and such a hard pen that the first lecture, the first reading of it, left him very sad. But he says that he was that his grandfather, so I think he was talking about his maternal grandfather from the context here, and a captain called La Largère. Now I've looked up La Largère, and it seemed he was also a Huguenot refugee, and in fact some previous proceedings of the Huguenot Society from the early 20th century talk about the La Largère family. So who knows, perhaps we have some descendants of them as well in the audience. But it seems that the particular La Largère he's talking about is perhaps the father of a young man who was actually bequeathed £20 in the Earl of Galway's will. So, and they seem to have been quite well off. So, but I was very curious about what his grandfather and this captain were discussing with his father that kind of made his father perhaps change his mind between this quite harsh letter that he received before the 6th of January and then this rather more conciliatory letter of the 6th of January. And it's not 100% clear. So I do have a hypothesis about this, which is that possibly it has something to do with his marriage, because I haven't been able to find anywhere a record of Louis Simon Uri's marriage, except that we know that his daughter, according to the Jersey records, was born in February of 1749. So I was curious about when he might have been married then. So perhaps discussing these things with his father, he doesn't, the only thing is, I mean, I'm sure if he had married without his father's consent, I almost perhaps would have expected him to seem even more, regretful of that. So it's hard to tell. Perhaps one day might discover some, record of the date of his marriage, or perhaps even the previous letter, which he describes as having been so harsh and with such black and strong ink that it left such a saddening impression on this poor son. So, until then, it remains a little bit unclear. But I just thought that was very curious. This correspondence. Now we also have kind of similar sons kind of, falling over themselves, almost trying to seem very humble in supplication to their parents, in a letter from Paul Henry Uri to his parents, which was from a few years earlier. So it was while he was working on a ship, and he explains in great detail that he needs new clothes and he needs some money from his parents, but he's saying, oh, but I haven't been spending it in any kind of a foolhardy manner. I've been very very cautious with everything. Oops, I've been very cautious with everything. Yes, so I really need your help, and he goes into a lot of detail about the fact that he really needs new shirts and new handkerchiefs and a lot of new things, and detailing specific price. And then when he said that, he mentions also that he's very, very grateful as well. So it's almost a similar style, I thought, between this letter and the previous one. Let me see if we can. Yes, and then going down the years, so I wasn't able to find much correspondence that possibly exists somewhere between Paul Henry Uri and his own sons. Only mention, kind of this personal nature of correspondence. Of course, there is a lot of military correspondence that he's engaged in, and I'm going to mention some of that in a minute as well, held in the National Archives at Kew. But it does seem that he's quoted as having had a large and extensive family of sons, according to some detail about it that I found in a doctoral thesis, which is about the 18th century Navy. So that was interesting that his family is described in that way. So I did have a look at some letters about Paul Henry Urey's health in the National Archives as well. So talking about the fact that he was at sea, and sometimes even he does mention that one of the ships that he was stationed on was actually sunk at one point, and he lost various papers. Possibly he lost some family correspondence in as well. Hard to know. He's likely more asking for dispensation because of important legal documents, perhaps, but it's a possibility, I suppose. Then later, there's a letter where he writes, there's a holding in the National Archives where Paul O'Reilly mentions that he's just recovered from the stone and gravel. And he actually writes this on the 1st of January, 1771. And I mentioned that his father actually died on the 4th of January. So it must have been a very hard year for him, because he's already suffering illness himself that year, unfortunately. So he mentions that he suffered from stone and gravel. So just in case anyone didn't, you probably know this, but it is kidney stones, not any kind of affliction with actual kind of gravel that we use in the past. And he also mentions suffering from illnesses like this, even several years later, unfortunately, to his sister Elizabeth. He actually writes in English to her, which they don't always do, and says that we're such invalids that we cannot come together. Chalk stones continually coming out from different parts of my body. Didn't have great health, unfortunately, in his latter few years. I know he actually, oh yes, January 11th, actually, that's when this letter was dated, and that's actually today, in 2023. And unfortunately, I think Paul actually died the following year. But the principal object of this letter to Elizabeth, where he mentions the chalk stones, is actually to console her on her husband's death. So that's Samuel Busfield. So he does talk in great detail, saying that earthly suffering is nothing compared to the reward they'll have in heaven, and Samuel was such a good man that surely everything will work out. But then, in spite of the fact that he kind of does go into this detail, he then says that the less is said of such occasion is best, and therefore I shall not dwell on the afflicted situation you were in, even though he kind of does. But he just claims that. I'm sure perhaps he might have gone into more detail had he felt appropriate. Okay, then we've got Samuel Busfield, who I just mentioned passed away. I just want to look at some of his family correspondence as well, because it's quite interesting to those who like Huguenot history. So we also have a letter. He didn't date it, but it appears to have been written around 1752, because he mentions that he began working in the French church 2 years before, which I think he started in 1754. So it can 1756 he would have written it around, yeah. He writes to his uncle and cousins in France, and he starts off saying that he was so young when he left, and his parents perhaps didn't particularly want him to stay in contact with the family in France. So he does actually mention in his letter that now that his parents are dead, he feels comfortable writing to his uncle and cousins in France, which I thought was curious. And he says here, if you can read the French, he said, Je tâche de me rappeler que j'ai un oncle et des cousins en France, et c'est de cette manière que je l'ai pris de vouloir bien se souvenir qu'ils ont un neveu et un cousin en Angleterre. So he reminds himself that he's got an uncle and cousins in France, and in the same way, he asks them to remember that they've got a nephew and cousin in England. And he's kind of creating this, Outremer, like cross-channel connection. And he actually writes as well that he's really grateful that his parents took him from France as a child and that he was able to grow up, in the Protestant religion. But rather than kind of reprimanding his relations for not having done the same, he actually tells them that if they ever do decide to come to England themselves as well, and follow the Protestant faith, he would welcome them. It's quite conciliatory. So notable that he mentions that as well. And he does also say that he actually, if you can read the French here, he says that he actually began preaching in English for some years, but then accepted to work in one of the refugee churches. So that's how we can kind of try and guesstimate the year that it was written. But it seems that he did write this before he got married to Elizabeth Uri. So years later, also have a letter that he writes to his wife when he's going visiting families around the north of England, who it seems that he knew from a few years ago. Curiously, again, he doesn't date this. I couldn't find any date of year or month on it, but unusually he writes that he wrote on Friday at 3 p.m. Whereas most of the time it seems it's the other way around in this kind of correspondence. People write the date and month and year, but he just writes Friday 3 p.m. What's nice is that he says, with this family he's staying with that he knew when he was younger in England, perhaps I got the impression from this that this was the period when he was preaching in English. Perhaps he's gone back to visit the people that he was working with then, and he says, they toast his wife's and child, their health at all the meals. But then he also mentions that he's happy that his wife and child have gone on a walk with one of their family friends, and he says, I hope he didn't run too much in the forest for fear of becoming wild, like comme elle. So I wasn't 100% sure if he meant the peur de devenir sauvage comme elle, like to become wild like the forest, which and because of course there are some common places in the 18th century of forests and wilderness and nature perhaps, but the family friend who they went on a walk with was also female, so I wasn't 100% sure if he's saying don't become wild like the forest or don't become wild like this friend. It's a little bit ambiguous. If anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear. But we also, it's worth noting that if you can see on the side of this letter, it seems he's kind of jotted in as kind of a postscriptum here, that the man he's staying with, Monsieur Nat, has asked if there's any more of the oil that they have. He'd like to have some more bottles of the oil. So he's kind of added it on as an afterthought. Just kind of this nice personal touch we can see there. And then, oops, keep clicking forward by accident. So then we've also got a letter from Samuel Busville, and this is how we can know that Louis Senior, so the kind of Louis Uri who came originally from France, and this is how we know that he was staying with them in Bethnal Green when he died. As well, his epitaph does mention that he died in Bethnal Green, but it wasn't 100% sure clear why he was in Bethnal Green, but this letter makes it clear that he was actually staying with his daughter and her husband Samuel while he was perhaps unwell, though of course he lived a very long life, and Samuel does say that he was actually in quite good health in this letter to Louis's daughter Anne, so to Samuel's sister-in-law, and says that so her sister Madeline seems to have been going away. So he decided to take the time to greet her and to talk about some matters that involve them both. And of course, he's commiserating with her on her father's death. And then he also includes as well as, kind words, he includes a sermon that he says, the person who's with you will be able to read it to you and show you how kind of connects to my point in question. And he says, and I salute both of you. I greet both of you. And I was saying, well, if Magdalene is gone, who is the person that's staying with Anne who will be reading this to her? And it seems to be one of her husband's grandchildren, if we can infer that from her mention that she stays with them in her will, which I will look at in a minute as well. But that's my theory anyway, that perhaps the person who is who she might have got to read this sermon to her, was one of her husband's grandchildren. So looking at the wills as well, so most of these wills are actually held in the National Archive, but if you're interested, you can actually download them for free if you make an account with them. So if that appeals to you, but I didn't include any photos of them because I wasn't sure that was allowed from the National Archives. So we've got Paul Henry O'Ree leaves his possessions primarily to his wife Charity. So it's Charity Treby, who I mentioned earlier. Did I skip one? Yes. So there's Isaac Florimond O'Ree. So he died a little bit before the other brothers, and they do mention in some of the letters as well. They do commiserate with each other about his death. But he mentions in his will that in the event of his death, he wants to appoint his brothers to be the executors of his will and guardians to his infant daughter. And he mentions that he wants Samuel Busville to do this if the others die. So kind of really shows how much he trusts Samuel Busville, because he would kind of trust him with that. I mean, he doesn't mention any of the other people's his other siblings husbands or spouses. And then we've got Lewis Simon Ory's will was made in Kinsale. And we do also have a letter that he wrote to Elizabeth, that's Elizabeth Busville, from Kinsale in 1776, where he mentions it's very expensive to live in Dublin. Then he goes down to Kinsale, it's not quite as expensive, but he writes that he leaves Irish currency to his relations. So it seems he was kind of dealing in that at the time. But then he kind of amends his will in 1779 again, so leaving money to his niece Anne O'Ree, who's the daughter of Isaac Florimond. So that would have been the infant daughter mentioned in the previous will. So just to make matters confusing, he has a niece called Anne, who's his brother's daughter, but he also has a daughter called Anne himself. Then he also leaves to his brother Paul, to his sisters Elizabeth and Magdalene. So it seems that his daughter Elizabeth, who is in the Jersey church record, it seems that she might have died, as he mentions, my beloved and only daughter Anne. So it's not clear when she died, though I wasn't able to find any date for that in the church records as of yet. Something might pop up in the future. So then, oops, I'm going to, here we go. So then we've got the will of Anne O'Ree, who is the sister of Isaac, Paul Henry, and Louis Simon. So she's also called Anne, and the sister of Elizabeth Busville as well, and of Magdalene, of course. And she was still living in Jersey when she wrote this. So her will, if I could show it, but I won't, just in case with the copyright issues. It's held in the Jersey archives, so it looks quite a bit different to the ones held at Kew, but it was made in Saint Helier anyway. And so she gives 60 livres de Coup de France. So these livres was currency used in Jersey until the change to the franc, which I believe was actually in 1795. But she leaves that to the poor of the parishes of Saint Helier and the Saint Ouen. And then what is interesting is she kind of mentions a bit more about leaving specific objects to people. Now, as far as I know, it does seem that kind of leaving objects to people is a little bit more common in female wills of the time other than men's wills, which might focus more on monetary matters. But she mentions that she gives all her family paintings to her sister Magdalene, which she spells differently. And she gives 2 silver chandeliers to her sister Elizabeth Visible. So yeah, I do wonder where these are now. And I know a lot of people are very interested in material history. So who knows, perhaps one day we'll be able to track them down. I do think we do have actually some artifacts from Lewis Uri in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. These silver chandeliers, I'm not sure. So then she gives any money that remains to 2 of her husband's petites filles, who she says have lived with her for a long time, and with whom she has a great friendship. So because she says that she has no need, and she thinks most of her people in her family don't really have any need of the fortune that remains to her, and most of that fortune is actually from her late husband. So she was kind of living off a lot of that after he died. So it seems that perhaps the fact that she refers to these petites filles as being of her husband, not of herself, I think it might be because they weren't actually blood relations of her, because it seems that Ricard, Edouard Ricard, her husband, was married before her to a woman called Jeanne Lapierre, and they had many children. And if you're interested in that, I can tell you all the dates that those children were born as well. But she died 2 years before, and herself was married and married to Ricard, and they don't appear to have any children, at least not in that I could find in the Jersey records. And she might have been a little bit old at that stage as well when she was married to him to have had children. So that's what I think about that will anyway. Let's see if I can change the slide. Oh yeah, so this is a curious matter as well. So we've got Paul Henry Uri and his correspondence with, well, not exactly correspondence, but a letter of complaint about him, about his conduct from the Duc d'Aiguillon, which was during the Bataille des Cardinaux, as it's known in French, or normally in English we call it the Battle of Quiberon Bay, which is an event during the 7 Years' War. And what I think is actually most interesting about it is the fact that the family decided to kind of keep hold of this in the archive. So basically, I don't expect anyone to be able to zoom in and read the writing here. It is in English, though I'm not able to tell. But it's a letter of complaint from this French Duc d'Aiguillon. So he's a fairly significant figure in French military history and naval history, as people might be aware. And he complains that Paul Henry Uri went and set alight some ships of his in the middle of this battle, and took away the artillery. It's a little bit unclear. I could find conflicting accounts. Well, I could find limited information, you know, in history books and sources about what really went down. But you know, it's a little bit hard to decipher what exactly Paul, you know, actually admits to have done, and what the Duc d'Aiguillon accuses him of having done, whether he's justified in doing so or not. You know, and I found an interesting article on this episode in the Cahiers de Guérin, which I can send the link to as well if people are interested in. That it is in French, and kind of describes this discussion with them. So, you know, who was right or wrong in this case is a little bit hard to tell, though. Oh, and here's a painting of that battle, in case you're interested as well. So this work is in the public domain. So I made sure of that before using the presentation. And here's also a picture of Paul Henry Uri. So I was saying, because he's a little bit more significant figure in British history. And apparently the slave boy he's pictured with here was actually called Jersey, which I thought was interesting. Not sure what we can read into that, but slightly referenced to the place where he's born. So let's talk a little bit about, I actually see someone said in the chat something about the language used in the letters, and that's actually what I'm completely fascinated by. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about in relation to that is something called code switching, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's kind of a concept related to kind of social linguistics about when people are bilingual, they often change from one language to another depending on the context. And in some of these letters, we can see that they actually write these family members actually write them bilingually. So for example, here, I mean, most of the letter that Louis Uri writes to his father Louis about his time in America that I talked about earlier. Most of the time he writes completely in French, but he also says Nouvelle York when he's speaking in the city in relation to his brothers. Then he calls it New York when he's discussing a matter connected to his wife. So perhaps it was because she was English. Perhaps, you know, his mind was just elsewhere. But more rich examples can be found in the next few letters. So here we've got one from same guy, so Louis Simon Uri, to his sister when he was in Ayr, so he's in Scotland, and most of the letter is in French. So it's one of those things where he starts the letter and then completes it afterwards. Not with such big gap between the beginning and continuing the letter as he had with the one to his father from America. But here he begins the letter in French on the 29th of January. And so you might be able to see there at the beginning, it says Edinburgh de 14, talking about how many flights or how many floors there were in a house they were staying in. And then he continues on the following day, January 30th, and he says in English, I couldn't finish it yesterday, but I hope to conclude it now. So he's just suddenly started talking in French. Now, perhaps this is because, you know, when he was writing in French, he was kind of sitting down thinking about it. Perhaps when he began the next day in English, he had just been talking in English to people he was working with, and that was the frame of mind he was in. It's possible. But what's interesting is that he then switches back again to French in this letter, and he includes, before he ends the letter, he has 2 long paragraphs, very emotional paragraphs about, you know, his family, which are in French. And then he writes again in English, you know, inquiring about more basic things and saying that he'll enclose a letter from another friend of theirs as well. But then he signs off in French, the letter as well. Do you have a picture of that? Oh, sorry, he signs it off in English. So he ends a section in English here. So if you can see at soonest, I think it says there, if you can read the ending of the first paragraph, you can see it's in English. Then he changes to French, talking about his family. So it's like talking about asking her to embrace his family members for him, and sending them best wishes. And then he mentions that he's enclosing a letter from someone else in English, and then he signs it in English as well. I am, dear sister, your very affectionate brother. So he's kind of changing from one language to another there. And you note the later hand as well is written on the side, so it seems that someone has kind of put in some extra information there for putting in the archive of the family. So then we have another letter from him to his sister, which is almost all in English, except for at the very end, where he's asking about brother, I think he means his brother-in-law here, Samuel Busville. He says, how does brother keep his health? Et comment va son mal de tête? Which is kind of interesting that he puts that in there, and he switches back to French there, because in the previous paragraph he was talking about, he was still in Scotland at this time, and he's talking about the fact that he met all these Scottish herdsmen and they only have whiskey to offer him and they speak no English. So it's kind of interesting that he's from this French-speaking background. He's using mostly English in this letter, where he's used a lot of French in the previous one, but just when he's asking about the illness of his brother-in-law, he switches back to French. And then he complains about other people not being able to speak English. So it's kind of a lot of dynamics going on there. So this is the epitaph of Louis Uri. So just to mention briefly before we wrap up, because I think I might be running out of time. But this is the epitaph of Louis Uri, and it was we can see Elizabeth Bisfield's name here, which caused it to be erected. So I think you can see this in London. If I think I did look it up, and you can't. I haven't been yet to do that. But let's think a little bit about his legacy for his family. So I was talking about the journal that Louis Uri wrote about his departure from France at the beginning. And actually, in a lot of the letters his sons write to him, they kind of have some similar descriptions of the ports they visit. And they have a similar style of reported speech when they're talking about engaging in conversations with other people. And they also kind of mix language a little bit. So Louis Uri himself mostly writes in French, but in his journal account that I talked about at the beginning, sometimes he quotes other people talking to him in English, so he quotes them directly. But sometimes he kind of mixes the two languages, and his sons do continue to do that a little bit, at least in the letters that they write to him, and maybe a little bit to each other as well. So perhaps he kind of rubbed off on them a little bit. So I just want to mention a little bit about the format and the material presentation of the documents. Some curious things. So we see these later editions. So like I was saying, this letter that I showed at the beginning, where Louis Uri talks about his kind of eureka moment where he kind of realizes that, you know, the true value of God and dedicates his spirit to him. Someone has written à l'original signé Louis Uri. So it's a little bit curious. And you know, we see that someone has written on the side as well, although they appear to have written that it was dated 1759, but it seems here that it says 1758. And another thing that would make me think that this letter is from 1758 is the fact that it was in December of this year that he writes this letter, and he says in it that he was glad at his family having grown with a new birth. And actually his son Paul has just had a son in November of that year. So it seems possible that he was actually referring to that in this letter. So, and then within but not even thinking about any later editions, just within the letters that the sons are sending to their father, and that sometimes, well, they use a lot of non-standard spellings, but of course, you know, even people who were living in France all their lives might have been doing that at this period in particular. But what's interesting about it is that sometimes they kind of correct themselves. So we see here, you can see that there's a little scribbled out on this letter. And some things added in. For example, here we've got a little arrow saying that someone has said marché, right? He's Louis Uri, he's put in the word marché there. And sometimes he corrects himself if he's written something wrong at first. Sometimes the correction is, you know, also not standard French today. But it's interesting that he kind of considers these things to be important to write in this correct French, despite not, you know, living there, of course. Then this true mystery, which is this poem that's also in the archive, which is signed it's written by Lewis Simon, apparently, and it's called Journal d'un triste voyage de Plimpton Dartmouth. And it's a poem in French about, you know, very kind of a ship that's rocking, and, you know, people are feeling sick on the ship. But he talks about someone called Le Pauvre Margoton, which I think is just a diminutive. Mostly he also calls her just Margot, and saying that she felt very sick on it. But it's just not clear to me who Margot was, because I can't find any mention of someone called Margot, you know, in the church records. Perhaps she was a servant, because he just mentioned that she, that this Margot read or tried to read, and it says that she tried to read for her her mistress as well. read stories for her mistress during this rocky journey. So clearly this person was able to read, or at least a little bit, if she's able to read a book on this, or try to, on this very rocky journey. But it's also possible that he just made the story up, I suppose. But if anyone has any thoughts on that, it'd be interesting to hear as well. So yes, I think that's kind of the note I'm gonna end this on. So of course, much remains unknown and unknowable, but I hope I've touched a little bit on the importance of religion and of family networks, to Huguenots, uprooted from their homeland, but also kind of getting to grips with society. It's very important for this family certainly to feel strong connections to each other. So thank you very much. Hope